Hi. I had the privilege 4 years ago to actually come to BIF and speak on this stage. And I have to say, walking up those stairs was actually one of the scariest moments of my life. Not because I'm that afraid of public speaking. I've given thousands of public talks over my life. But what scared me was I had been given the instruction that in my talk I had to share something about my personal life. And in all the thousands of talks I've given, I had never shared anything from my personal life. And in fact, I had been taught over my childhood that actually sharing anything about yourself is extremely dangerous. So I overcame the fear and came up on stage, and I have to thank Saul and his team for pulling me out of my comfort zone and giving me a chance for growth. And I thought today what I would do is build a bit on the story I told last time. I talked about my childhood and the fact that actually until I was 16, I had not lived in the United States. And I lived in a different country every year. So a constant change, constant movement. And that would have been challenging enough as a small child. But in addition, I actually came from a very dysfunctional family and endured extreme, sustained emotional abuse. One of my earliest memories was my mother yelling at the top of her voice in one of her rages, "I wish you had never been born. My life would have been so much better without you here." And that was just a sample of what I had to go through. And what was interesting in terms of my reaction to that, I could have responded with anger, with negativity. I could have fought rage with rage. But instead what I did was I withdrew. I withdrew to my room. And I found escape in books. I developed a particular interest and fascination with science fiction because it allowed me to explore worlds of possibility and potential and allowed me to escape what was in my surroundings. And I found that over time, just the world of imagination, the world of ideas wasn't enough. And so I became involved in movements of various types, a very diverse set of movements, but they all had one common theme, which was opposition to government. I think psychologists would have a field day describing my problems with authority and how it's manifested in my movement activity. I went into college in the late 60s, early 70s, and at the time, in my freshman year, I was the chairman of the campus chapter of a group called Young Americans for Freedom, which, for those of you who remember, was a leading Goldwater conservative group. But what was really interesting, at the same time that I was chair of the campus chapter of Young Americans for Freedom, I was also chair of the campus chapter of a group called Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, the leading anti-war group at the time in the US. And in fact, in my sophomore year, I led the occupation of the administration building of my university, just down the road, Wesleyan University. A week-long occupation. In my junior year, I negotiated with my university to do a year abroad. They were very happy. And the agreement was I had to stay away for the entire year. I couldn't come back. And I spent 6 months, the first 6 months of my year abroad in Kenya, studying the Mau Mau movement and the war for independence against the British colonialists in Kenya. And then in the second 6 months, I went to Algeria and spent time studying the war for independence in Algeria against the French. So over time, I've been involved in a lot of movements, and both studying them and participating in them. And I thought what I would do today is share some of the lessons learned from my experiences. And probably the best place to begin is defining what I mean by movement, because movement is one of those terms that's used quite loosely. Specifically, what I want to focus on are organized efforts, not just spontaneous, self-organizing efforts, but organized efforts to pursue an agenda, a political, social, economic agenda, by mobilizing a very large number of independent participants through grassroots movement, through grassroots activity. So that's what I would define as a movement, or where my interest is. And I would say that over the course of time, the key thing that I have taken away from my experience and study of movements is there are two things that need to come together to really make a successful movement. One of them is what I call a narrative, and the other is what I call creation spaces. And I'll talk a little bit about both because they're not completely intuitive. And in fact, I'll talk about narrative with some trepidation because I'm here in the temple of storytelling. But I want to try to make a distinction between stories and narratives. And I know most people use them interchangeably. They basically mean the same thing. I think there is a distinction to be made. Call it bleep and blop, if you will. I prefer to call it stories and narratives. But when I talk about stories, typically what I mean there is something that's a self-contained experience. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's a resolution to it. Something happens to resolve the story. The other key element of a story is the story is about me, the storyteller, or it's about those people over there. It's not about you. I mean, you can listen, you can use your imagination to figure out what you would have done in that story. But be clear, the story is not about you. Now, in contrast, I think for me, what a narrative is, number one, it's open-ended. There is no resolution. It's to be resolved. There's some broad opportunity or something on the horizon that can be achieved. But it's not a given. It's not guaranteed. It's to be resolved. And the resolution of that narrative hinges on you. It hinges on the choices and actions you're going to take. What's it going to be? How are we going to resolve this narrative? So I think it's an interesting contrast. There are many examples of narratives throughout history. I mean, at one level, Christian religion has a narrative. We were all born in sin. There was a Savior that came, and you have an opportunity to seek salvation. But it's not guaranteed. It's up to you. What are you going to do? There's a Marxist narrative. Workers were born in chains, slaves to the capitalist oppressor. We have an opportunity to achieve a society and an economy that is going to allow all of us to achieve our potential. But it's not guaranteed. What are you going to do? Are you going to join and make this happen? So those are a couple of examples of the kinds of narratives that I think have driven people throughout history. And I don't in any way want to undermine or underemphasize the power and importance of stories. But what I like to say is if you want to understand the power of narrative, realize that throughout history, millions of people have given their lives for narratives. They have made the ultimate sacrifice for a narrative. You want to talk about power? That's power. So I think there's a real opportunity to harness that power of narrative. And I think it exists at multiple levels. I've written about the fact that we all have, each of us individually has a narrative. Most of us haven't taken the trouble to articulate it, express it, even to ourselves, much less to anyone else. But we have a narrative. If you look at the arc of our lives, we have made choices and taken actions that demonstrate an implicit narrative. There's an opportunity for institutions to have narratives. And there's an opportunity for social entities of various types, cities, regions, movements, to have a narrative. So I think one of the core questions is, what is our narrative? And is it one that is going to lead us to more potential and possibility, or is it one that's going to hold us back? because we have an opportunity to evolve that narrative over time. So that's one element that I think is a key requirement for a successful movement as I've defined it, a narrative, a compelling narrative. And by the way, for reasons I won't go into, I think those narratives need to be opportunity-based narratives as opposed to threat-based narratives. And one of the issues, I believe, at least in our political lives in the US, is on both sides of the aisle, we have fallen back to threat-based narratives. So narrative is really key in terms of inspiration and focus and movement to action. The other question is, well, how do we act as part of a movement? And in that context, I think there's a real potential around something that I call creation spaces. What do I mean by creation spaces? Basically, creation spaces have two components to them. At one level, they bring together small groups of people, typically 10 to 20 people, who engage in collaborative action and exploration together. And then they're connected in a broader environment where they can connect with each other and share experiences and learn from each other more broadly. So there's two components, small groups, 10 to 20 people, and a broader environment where they can collaborate and learn from each other. I originally came across the notion of creation spaces when I started looking at areas like extreme sports and online video games, war games, World of Warcraft, classic example. In all of those environments, you had creation spaces emerging that drove accelerated learning and sustained extreme performance improvement. I'd never really thought about it in the context of movements until I read an article by Malcolm Gladwell. I believe it was called The Cellular Church. And he was looking at the evangelical movement in the United States. And he said, you know, there's something really wrong because in the media, when we talk about the evangelical movement, we focus on these mega churches and the showtime that occurs on Sunday with these massive screens and tens of thousands of congregants coming together. He said, that's not where the action is. The action in these evangelical churches is the people who participate in them come together into small groups, typically 6 to 10 people, who meet on a regular basis, a couple times a week, in between these Sunday services. And their whole focus is on how can we act and make a difference, given our beliefs in society. And they hold each other accountable, and they learn from each other, from the experiences that they have as they go out into society together. And I'll have to say that from all my experiences in movements, the effective movements that I've been part of have had these creation spaces. Small groups, call them cells, teams, units, whatever, who come together with a mutual commitment to action, holding each other accountable, developing deep trust-based relationships with each other, and learning very quickly by connecting more broadly across all these units. So really interesting and powerful combination. If we can bring together narratives, particularly opportunity-based narratives, and this notion of creation spaces to drive action and accelerate learning, that's a way to achieve very significant impact. Now, the one other key point I want to make is that, again, at least from my experience, going back to my childhood, I think too often when we form movements or participate in movements, we do tend to fall into this oppositional mindset. There's an enemy out there. We have to crush the enemy, confront the enemy. Well, I'm a huge fan of the art of war. And one of the key lessons from the art of war is if you have to engage the enemy in battle, you've already lost the war. Now, I understand in some cases confrontation is absolutely essential. But I go back to my childhood experience and say, wherever possible, avoid that confrontation. Focus on harnessing worlds of potential and possibility on the edge and pull people into that rather than pushing to crush the enemy. And if you're successful in pulling people to these edges around potential and possibility, around those opportunity-based narratives, you will change the world. Thank you very much.